So our next speaker is, and she'll be giving closing remarks, is the Director Kate Gordon of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. She also serves as the Governor's Senior Advisor on Climate. Director Gordon is a thought leader on energy and climate issues, and prior to joining the Newsom administration, she's held leadership positions at several prestigious nonpartisan institutes. Director Gordon got her start on energy and climate issues working to craft progressive policies at the intersection of labor, business, community, and environmental interests at the National Apollo Alliance, where she ultimately served as his co-executive director until the merger with the Blue-Green Alliance in 2011. Director Gordon has a JD and a master's in city and regional planning from UC Berkeley and an undergraduate degree from Wesleyan University. Welcome, Director Gordon.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It's always so funny to hear my undergraduate degree in an intro, but it was important to my life. It's such an honor to be here with all of you, and a huge honor to follow my good friend Chris Field, with whom I've had the pleasure to work on a variety of projects over the last few years. I have to say there is no better embodiment of that intersection of scientific integrity and public service than Chris. Also, he's like the calmest doomsayer ever, right? I mean, no one else can say it's totally terrifying and make it sound like they're like reading for a meditation app. I mean, it's amazing to me. It calms me down every time I hear Chris talk about our dire future. And it also calms me down to know he's working on it. So I know you've had a long 2 days full of amazing scientific insights and expertise and a lot of people talking to you. So I will keep this fairly short. I've been working on climate issues for about 20 years, first as an organizer and then through policy engagement, stakeholder engagement, as you heard. And for a lot of that time, the way we talked about the climate challenge was primarily to say, here's the climate science on the one hand, and then here are our big policy fixes or regulatory fixes on the other. I used to work in Washington, and I used to joke that for DC policymakers, and I was one, we defined the problem as inconvenient truth, right? And then we defined the solution as the Waxman-Markey bill, which was the big federal cap and trade bill. And those were basically the conversations about climate. And, that's still somewhat true. The science is still critically important, as Secretary Blumenfeld, I know, really noted in his opening remarks, as you've heard for the past 2 days, as Chris really underscored just now. But what was missing, I think, for a lot of the last 2 decades of conversation about climate, and what this administration, the Newsom administration, is working really hard to correct, is that people were not part of that equation. We weren't focused on impacts on people, on solutions by people. Ultimately, climate change stems from human behavior, and its impacts are deeply personal. And so people really are at the center of this challenge. As you heard, I think, on yesterday on your session on California's health and well-being, we're already experiencing significant climate impacts in California. Actually, you don't even have to hear this, you know this if you live in California. These span the gamut from fires to floods to drought to extreme heat. We even have glacial melt in the northern Sierras. We have everything. And those impacts are already being felt across our whole population. And the key is that they're being felt differently by different people across our population. Historic and pre-existing systemic injustices, including redlining significantly and a lack of sufficient affordable housing, have meant that these burdens disproportionately have fallen on California's underserved communities and on communities of color and Black and Brown communities. How do we move forward from this and ensure our pathway to carbon neutral economy is a sustainable one, a resilient one, and an inclusive one? That's really the central question of this administration. And you won't be surprised to hear that a big part of the answer to that is science. And we at my office, the Office of Planning and Research, spend a lot of time thinking about how to marry the best available science with the best available stakeholder process and community engagement. So we bring that people piece back to the equation. Through the Integrated Climate Adaptation Research Project Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resilience Project run out of OPR, we're working with key community stakeholders to define what makes a community vulnerable to climate impacts, including working with a couple of organizations to map the state's most vulnerable communities, looking at a variety of factors. That work relies on us having the best available climate impact projections downscaled to the community level alongside the best available intelligence on how those impacts actually are affecting those communities. That best available intelligence on community impacts, of course, comes from the communities themselves. One key input to that process is, frankly, the OEHHA indicator reports, which have provided us hugely valuable insight into how climate change is already affecting the state using observed data, using historic data. We really look forward to continuing to work with OEHHA on stronger connections between those observed on the ground impacts and our work to understand future climate risk, particularly through the California climate assessments. And we just, finally gotten codified in statute in the last legislative session, the 5th climate assessment. So this is something that we're starting to look at now and build toward now. We're also looking forward to building on OEHHA's work to inform the next update to the state adaptation strategy, which used to be known as safeguarding, but we're working to change that name. As we see an acceleration of climate impacts in California, we need to better link what we're seeing on the ground today with what climate scientists and climate science is telling us about what's to come. And we're every day, I think, more and more able to do that because of incredible and impressive gains in cloud computing and in just crowd-sourced scientific information from around the globe. Look, these are unprecedented times. I don't need to tell you that, but what this year has highlighted, frankly, has put in stark relief is what happens when we don't take a systems approach, when we don't build in resilience, when we don't engage communities, and especially our most vulnerable communities, in crafting solutions. So I and my team at OPR and across the administration look forward to working with all of you and with all Californians to come out of this year, not bouncing back, but bouncing forward to a more equitable and more science-based future. And we really, really look forward to that partnership. And I will leave it at that and just say thank you for everything you're doing for your communities, for the state, and for the future of the planet.
Well, thank you so much for those remarks. And it's been wonderful working with OPR and linking those reports and those assessments. So I think we have a couple minutes for questions. I see that we might have one. Okay, well, I'll ask it. Is there a financial impact report on climate impacts that includes all impacts, including COVID?
Yeah, that's a good question, but a tough one. The governor, well, let me take a step back. We are actually very, very interested in the financial impact question. And this is something Chris and I have worked on together actually in the past, and we continue to work on in this administration, which is the fiscal impact of current climate events is significant. This year alone, the state of California has spent $1 billion on firefighting. And that is just personnel and equipment, and that is $650 million over budget, just to be clear how big of a deal that is for us. So we've spent a lot of time over the last 2 years working with the Department of Finance to really look at and underscore those fiscal impacts, both on our own budget. We are a major asset owner as a state, and also in terms of investment through our pension funds. And the governor just came out with a climate investment framework recognizing that impact, we have as a state joined the International Coalition on Climate Resilient Investors to get a handle on how different investors are calculating those risks. And we also have been asked by the governor to form a work group on climate risk disclosure. So I would say we're sort of at the beginning of the process of answering that question, but I really want to put out a caveat, Lauren, which is, if anyone tells you they have a definitive answer to that question, they're not telling you the truth, because the fact is those impacts are incredibly specific. They're specific to localities, they're specific to people, they're specific to industries. And unless you have like an asset level, individual building level analysis, you're just not going to have the answer to that. But we have some really good information in broad terms on what kind of costs we're talking about, and they're incredibly significant. The last thing I'll say is that we also know from FEMA estimates that every dollar spent on resilience saves us, between $6 and $11 on emergency response later on. So we do know how to bring those costs down.
Okay, very good. I have another question. What aspects of climate science policy or the stakeholder process are currently contentious? But if we look back in 20 more years, will we all wish we had aligned on the bigger picture faster?
Yeah, that the contentious pieces are super wonky, but this is a wonky crowd, so I can maybe get into them a little bit. Chris showed you one of his slides, or a couple of his slides, about the RCP pathways, right? There's the classic, like, which of those numbers do you choose? Like, which pathway do you model in terms of where we are today, right? And there's the business as usual pathway, and then you try to go down below that to get to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. There's actually a lot of controversy around which pathway to choose when doing modeling. There's a set of people who think that those of us, and I'm one of these people, that think we need to model business as usual are being too pessimistic, and we're essentially allowing for business as usual to be a possibility, and that we shouldn't even model it. We should only model below that. I just think it's really important to be realistic. I think in this, in the world of climate policy, one thing I have learned the hard way is that if you overpromise on job numbers, on policy impact, on affordability, if you overpromise and underdeliver, you can set yourself back years on climate policy. And so I tend to be very pragmatic about it, but you'd be surprised. There's a very active debate on this subject online. I think a lot of the other science is pretty uncontroversial, to be honest. I think a lot of what we think of as climate denial politically is actually just masking a real deep discomfort with what this is going to mean for various sectors of the economy and for various stakeholders in the economy. I think we're talking about a transition that's going to have a significant impact across every industry and every sector. And in places heavily dependent on carbon intensive sectors, that's very scary. And I think that fear gets masked as a denial of the science, but I think it's really fear of what that looks like. And so it's our job. One thing my office has been tasked with by the governor is figuring out a just transition roadmap. It's our job to figure out how to make it less scary and to make it something that people can get behind.
Okay. And thank you. And a final question. We've heard quite a bit over the last couple days about sort of the promise of working lands to capture carbon, to offer greater adaptation in terms of water resources. And I wonder if you care to comment on that.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Look, we know from pretty much every credible scientific analysis that's been done about what we need to do to meet our climate goals globally, that carbon capture and storage, carbon removal is part of the solution. I mean, Chris called it negative emissions. I agree with him. It's a necessary piece of the puzzle. Lands play a big role in that. So the governor just released an executive order, as you all know, on natural working lands, calling for 30% of our lands and coastal waters to be conserved by 2030. That executive order really highlights the multiple benefits of our lands in California. It's the potential for carbon removal, which is significant. The fact that those lands act actually as a climate resilience, They promote climate resilience in a couple ways: wetlands preservation to reduce flooding, forest management to reduce wildfire. The very existence of those lands as a physical buffer between fires, floods, and developed parts of the state. You see this I just drove through Napa over Thanksgiving week, and you can see it. You actually can see where the fire stops at the vineyard and doesn't get to the developed areas. So lands are a big part of the picture. They're not the only one. We actually also have to do what we call engineered carbon removal, which means carbon removal at hard to decarbonize industrial sites, potentially direct air capture. There's a lot of pieces of this, but there's no question that land plays a big role. The great news for us in California is that most of our land is undeveloped. 40 million of us only live on 6% of our land in California. So there's a lot of it. So the question is, how do we kind of come up with the partnerships with tribes, with the federal government, with local governments, with individual communities to come to a really strong stewardship agreements that will maximize, what we know from history of working with the lands, but also will maximize carbon removal, which again, we have to do. I mean, there's just not a question at this point that that's part of the picture.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time and coming to give your remarks, and it was really wonderful. And thank you also, Chris, for all your comments. So we'll move to the next segment, which is just further reflections on where we are and bringing to closure. So thanks again, Kate and